All right, we've talked about taste. Let's look at the way Kant defines the word imagination. You're going to notice he's going to rehash all of the terminology from Burke, but give it his own slight edge or point of view. Now, for Kant, imagination is a spontaneous, independent mental power which is enlivened and set free by aesthetic ideas. So, like Burke, he agrees that the imagination is spontaneous, it's free, and again, it starts to recombine things. In fact, just like Burke, Kant ascribes to the imagination the very power to recombine sense data into new forms and new associations. And that's got to do with the spontaneity. The imagination grabs the data and goes wild with it and makes new forms. So in this sense, Burke and Kant are similar. Now, Kant goes so far, though, to say that in poetry, the associational powers of the imagination are most set at liberty. In other words, imagination pops up in all the arts, but Kant felt that poetry sets the imagination most free, maybe because words are so malleable. But anyway, he felt that the imagination and its power of association, to make new associations, was something that reigned supreme, if you will, in poetry. All right, so far I have focused only on aesthetic, on subjective, on feelings. But Kant says that although, again, his aesthetic is grounded in concept-free feelings experienced by the imagination, he does admit that understanding and reason do play an important role in judgment. He's kind of contradicting himself, but what he's trying to do is develop. So we're going to see that understanding and reason do have something to do with taste and aesthetic. Let's begin here. Kant makes a very influential distinction between pure beauty and dependent beauty. Now, pure beauty presupposes no concept of what the object ought to be. In other words, pure beauty is purely free, purely subjective, purely aesthetic. And in fact, I would link this concept of pure beauty to a later 19th century concept that we call art for art's sake, or in Latin, ars gratia artis. The most famous art for art's sake person was Oscar Wilde. And those people that lived at the end of the 19th century, they had a belief that art was self-subsistent and an end in itself. No purpose, no motive, anything. Art for art's sake, art as an end in itself. And these people were very influenced by Kant's notion of pure beauty. The difference, though, is art for art's sake, somehow we always link it with that sort of moral decadence that we think of, Oscar Wilde and all. That's not in Kant. Kant's a pretty straightforward kind of guy. Definitely not an Oscar Wilde. But there's a similarity there between pure beauty and this art for art's sake school. All right, let's contrast this now from dependent beauty. According to Kant, dependent beauty presupposes a concept of perfection, against which to measure the object. In other words, dependent beauty adheres to purposes that are external to the object. In other words, dependent beauty starts to move its way into concepts. I think the best example I can give you is that dependent beauty is the kind of thing that would presuppose rules of decorum or dictums to teach and to please. In other words, dependent beauty does have some kind of criteria. It wants to follow decorum, or it wants to teach and please. There's some kind of concept that regulates the beauty. Now, one of the things that Kant notes that I think is very interesting is he notes that much of the disagreement among critics rises from the fact that they are comparing two different kinds of beauty. In other words, one critic is talking about pure beauty, the other one's talking about dependent beauty, and they don't realize they're at counter purposes. The pure beauty critic is talking about form. The dependent beauty is talking about the moral, or what it's about, or what it teaches us. And those are different kinds of beauty. They're both kinds of beauty, but one's pure and one's dependent. So again, I think he's right here that sometimes there's disagreements because we're talking about a different kind of beauty. Now, as soon as dependent beauty starts to form concepts like decorum, it moves out of the realm of the imagination and into the realm of the understanding. And for Kant, epistemologically speaking, understanding is a mental faculty that forms concepts. The aesthetic mental faculty is only interested in feelings, direct response. But as soon as we get into understanding, we become interested in concepts. I'll talk more about this a little bit later, but keep that in mind. All right, that's the beautiful. Let's move on to the sublime, because he has something to say about that as well, just as Burke did. Kant makes a distinction between two kinds of the sublime, between what he calls the quantitative sublime and what he calls the qualitative sublime. Now, first, his general definition for sublimity is that which is absolutely great, which inspires in us feelings of limitlessness and infinity. Pretty much the same as what Burke said. Remember, again, sublimity is an epistemological response. It inspires in us limitlessness and infinity. Now, the quantitative sublime, and Kant also calls this the mathematical sublime, occurs when we come into the presence of wild, chaotic objects that cannot be absorbed. In other words, it's too much for us. It's mathematically too much for us, or quantitatively too much for us, and we're overwhelmed. Their greatness surpasses the power of our intuition to grasp them. In other words, it's so powerfully, so overwhelming that our imagination can't hold it all. And Kant says that when this happens, when our imagination is absolutely overwhelmed by the quantitative sublime, you know what happens? We are forced to turn to reason to help us out. Now here's a distinction. Beauty turns to understanding. The sublime turns to reason. Let me explain the difference between understanding and reason. Whereas understanding merely converts sense data into concepts, reason takes these concepts and transforms them into higher laws. Let me explain a little bit more clearly. Imagination only has to do with feelings. We feel things spontaneously and we don't think about them. As soon as we start to think about our feelings, we've moved into the realm of understanding. Because once we start thinking about our feelings, we start making concepts. We start making correlations. We notice parallels. We're using our understanding. So when we start thinking about our feelings, that's understanding. But when we start to think about our thinking, that's when we get into reason. In other words, when we take those concepts and form them into higher, more general laws, we are into the realm of reason. Now, the beautiful turns to understanding. The sublime turns to reason. All right, that's the quantitative sublime. Let's look now at the qualitative, or what Kant also calls the dynamic sublime. If the quantitative sublime occurs when we can't absorb the object, the qualitative sublime occurs when we feel awe or fear before an object of overwhelming power. That's the qualitative sublime. Kant, by the way, just like Burke, reminds us that if there's any actual danger, it's not sublime anymore, it's just terror. So he agrees with Burke on that. Remember, again, sublimity, there can't be any actual physical danger. Now, in the qualitative sublime, just as in the quantitative sublime, what happens is, again, our imagination finds itself inadequate to stand up against such power and might. And so, just as before, it turns to the higher faculty of reason for help. So in both the quantitative and qualitative sublime, our imagination is so overwhelmed that it is forced to turn to reason to help it out. Now, in a moment, I'm going to explain the sort of upshot of that. But before I do that, I want to make one more distinction between the sublime and the beautiful. Okay, this is a distinction that Kant makes. Kant tries to explain to us that both the beautiful and the sublime consist in what he calls a free play of two different mental powers. In the case of beauty, first, Kant describes the subjective experience of beauty as a feeling of harmony in the free play of imagination and understanding. What beauty really is when our imagination and our understanding are in a sort of harmony, and they work together. That's beauty. That's the subjective experience of beauty. On the other hand, sublimity manifests itself in terms not of harmony, but a disharmony or struggle between imagination and reason. So beauty, mentally speaking, epistemologically speaking, is a harmony between imagination and understanding. Sublimity is a disharmony between imagination and reason. I would argue that in this distinction, Kant offers us a mental justification for Burke's assertion that beauty causes us to relax, while sublimity brings tension. Right? Tension, disharmony, relaxing, harmony. All right, now I want to come back to what I mentioned before, and that is, what is the upshot? What is the ramification of the sublime when we're forced to turn from imagination to reason? Kant builds on the mental disharmony induced in us by the sublime to posit a fascinating theory as to why the sublime moves us so powerfully. And by the way, the Critique of Judgment is an incredibly difficult work to read, but I believe it is worth plowing through the critique just to get to this end that I'm going to explain to you now, because I think this is awesome. This is something that blew me away the first time I read it. Let's build up to it. Now, first of all, Kant admits that our experience of the sublime at first gives us a sense of displeasure. Right? Because there's a mental disharmony between imagination and reason. So at first, there's a sense of displeasure because our imagination can't handle it, can't stand up to the magnitude and the might, and turns over. So at first, there's a displeasure. But, and here's the trick, eventually that displeasure turns to pleasure when we realize what this surrender from imagination to reason, what this surrender signifies or means. And this is what Kant says. Our experience of the sublime, that moment when imagination turns over to reason, that moment reveals to us that finally cognition or reason is supreme over sensation or imagination, and that therefore we are supra-sensible creatures. At that moment when imagination turns over to reason, we realize that at heart we are not sensible creatures tied to the earth, but we are suprasensible tied to reason. Kant says that in that moment we learn with great joy that there is a faculty within us that is greater than nature, that can surpass both her majesty, quantitative sublime, and her might, qualitative sublime. That is to say, and if that is true, if that discovery is true, that there is something within us greater than nature, do you know what that means? That means that our final destination and end is greater than that of nature. If there is something in us greater than nature that can take over, that means that there is something within us that, again, is greater than nature. That is to say, we are not only rational, but spiritual creatures, endued with purpose and an ability to endure and transcend pain and terror. Isn't that wonderful? Out of this epistemological response, Kant sort of proves to us that there must be something more to us, something more than mere animal, physical nature. There must be something greater in us, again, something that goes beyond nature. And that suggests, once again, that we have a purpose separate from that of nature. We are not just a member of the animal species. There is something more to us. There is an ability to transcend the pain and suffering that's related to nature and the physical. You know, I like to call this dazzling moment of insight the Kantian catharsis. Because this really is that catharsis as clarification, that aha moment when we say, wait a minute, there is something inside of me which is greater than nature. To me, that revelation is just wonderful when you get to the end of the Critique of Judgment. Finally, and this is something similar to what I said in Burke, although I am presenting Kant as a philosophical source of romanticism, we must remember that Kant himself, like Burke, lived in Pope's age of reason. So again, he still is privileging reason over imagination. Indeed, only an Enlightenment thinker could posit as the source of our greatest emotional experience the knowledge that we are rational. Right? Only an Enlightenment person could say, oh, the greatest thing in the world is when we realize we're rational and not just emotional. So again, he is at the source and at the heart of a theory that will become Romanticism, but like Burke, he still is living in the Enlightenment, and reason is more important for him. Now, as I mentioned before, when we get to the Romantics, they will raise imagination above judgment, synthesis above analysis. Also, let me say that in the next two lectures, Schiller and Hegel, again, because they are later theorists, they are already moving towards Romanticism. And so, in the next lecture, we will turn to Schiller and see how he takes Kant's beliefs and sort of romanticizes them.